Released in 1997 for the Nintendo 64, Tetrisphere is something of an interesting spin on the classic Tetris puzzle game, where you have a three-dimensional sphere as your playing field, and your main goal is to clear away the layers of blocks with strategically placed drops and slides in order to reach the core of the sphere and release the little creature trapped within. Tetrisphere has an interesting backstory to it. Developed by H2O Entertainment, it was originally intended as a title for the failed Atari Jaguar console in 1995 under the name Fear, but then Nintendo got the rights and eventually released the game for the N64, which is probably a good thing because H2O lasted long enough to release 3 more games for Nintendo before closing up shop in 2001. Those other 3 games in question are the new Tetris for N64, a subject of a prior video, Aiden Chronicles the First Mage, also for N64, and finally the group's sole Game Boy Advance outing, the Flintstones, Big Trouble in Lead Rock. And that's the last of the informational portion of this video. Let's get back to Tetrisphere. The general premise of Tetrisphere is to dig your way to the center of the sphere to free the little critter trapped within. And this is done by clearing lots of pieces of the same type from the sphere's surface, which involves shifting pieces around the surface to group them together, and landing another piece that you can control where it crashes onto the surface, but you only have a limited amount of time to move the furniture and land the piece in the right place, because if you misplace a piece, it will add to the sphere, and you will lose a try. Lose all your tries, and the game ends. The level is cleared when you've made enough of an opening for the little critter within to escape the sphere, at which point you move on to the next sphere, which has a slightly different arrangement, whether it be different pieces or more pieces or whatever the case may be. There are multiple modes of play in Tetrisphere. Aside from the main rescue mode, there's hide and seek, which adds additional objectives for you to complete, puzzle, which gives you a number of puzzles that you need to clear within a set number of moves, time trial, versus modes against the computer or a second player, and training mode. Regardless of how you play, the overall premise and gameplay remains the same, and much like any puzzle game worth a damn, Tetrisphere manages a sublime package that is fairly easy to understand, pick up, and play, yet eventually provides the player with a challenge that is difficult to master and difficult to put down. Despite not having any instruction manual, I bought this secondhand loose, I was able to figure out the controls and the mechanics of the game in fairly short time. But if you do need a primer on how to play the game, the tutorial is there for anyone who needs it, which is a rather helpful means of getting you up to speed. Control is pretty solid for the most part, as Tetrisphere can be played with either the D-pad or the analog stick, and both work about as well equally for moving your cursor around the little sphere. So if you're not fond of using the analog stick, you can avoid that business entirely and just stick with the D-pad, because there's no advantage in using one over the other. The only thing that might affect your control is the choice of avatar, of which there are several and each possessing their own stats. Why you need stats for a puzzle game is an answer only a few brilliant minds can manage, and unfortunately, those minds don't exist in the current climate. So Tetrisphere is a Nintendo 64 exclusive video game, which means you have some nice, pretty 3D graphics. Sorry. It's visually average fare, it's functional, the spinning of the sphere is done smoothly enough, the effects of breaking blocks is a nice touch, the animated backdrops are fine, and the little bits of animation with the little characters are serviceable. But what it's supposed to do, provide you with a nice, visually acceptable playfield that you have to look at for long periods of time. It gets the job done, and that's fine. Serenading you in the background are a number of techno tracks courtesy of Neil Voss, who would later compose the soundtrack for another N64 title called... oh, well, you know, the new Tetris. For what it's worth, you have a nice variety of tunes on here, and though they're not my particular cup of tea, at the very least they're an easy listen, they set the mood nicely, and they're generally quality tunes for those who like that sort of thing. Sound effects are just the thing that happen to be in the game, they work, they're non-intrusive, they're appropriate. Job well done, I suppose. Not much else to say. Overall, Tetrisphere is a well-executed original take on the puzzle game format, and certainly a unique title for the Nintendo 64, which is a bonus. It's about as good of a puzzle game as the usual suspects in the genre, and a concept I'm rather quite surprised never made a comeback in some form or fashion on the more recent hardware, which would have provided some additional graphical benefits. But I guess all that means is that Tetrisphere remains a Nintendo 64 exclusive, and honestly, if you're into puzzle games and looking for something different, it's definitely one worth checking out.